Welcome to Mythical Phylogeny Adventurers. I'm your guide, Jason. Hopefully by now, you're enjoying the holiday season. Be it whatever tradition you have. Decorating the house, baking cookies, or watching movies. Probably the classics, such as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, and Santa Claus is Coming to Town. And while watching the last one in particular, you're probably getting a little confused as to why these so-called Kringle elves have thick beards. Are these dwarves? Why is Tanta Kringle so tall compared to the others? What is going on? Most other depictions even show them as appearing young with no facial hair. Well, let's see if we can figure this one out. We will need to start by going back to Norse mythology, where the term elf originates. The word used there is elf, and a possible meaning is the white ones, or white beings, and they are said to be fairer than the sun. They are described as magical creatures that appear in the Prose Edda and other Norse writings. They could be either good or evil. Many were malicious and tricksters, but just as often were they benevolent. Interestingly, they may not have been viewed as humanoid, but more akin to how the Jotuns and giants were seen, and this comes up a bit later. They lived in Alfheim, or home of the elves. It is one of the 9 realms of Yggdrasil, and it is ruled over by a member of the Vanir, called Freyr. But this place does have a second name, Lofsalfheim, which means home of the light elves, Losafar. And this brings up Svartalfheim, also called Nidavellir, or Dark Fields, another of the 9 realms. It is described as an underground land which is inhabited by the Svartalf, or the Black Elves. They are said to be as different from the Light Elves as possible. Most depictions of the Dark Elves say that their skin is as dark as pitch tar, hence the name Dark or Black Elves. But they also have a couple more names, Myrkulfar or Murky Elf, and the more important here, Dokalafar. This either means Dark Elf or Deep Elf. Now, these folks were said to be talented craftsmen, even creating things like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and Gleipnir, the ribbon which held Fenrir in place. Their skills with metal and gold is what they are usually pulled into the main story for. Their name eventually changed into Dvergr, then Dwargaz, and eventually the more common name of Dwarf. But there is an issue. There might be a difference between the Dark Elf and the Black Elf, though the general consensus is that they are the same. So it seems that elves and dwarves were at one time the same thing. And we see this often in other stories. Since it is near Christmas, let's look at a story of German folklore. The tale of the silver pine cones. A woman's family was poor and very ill. She went out into the woods to collect pine cones to sell. While there, she met a magical creature who turns the pine cones she had collected into silver to sell. Most will either use elf or dwarf here, but a few use fairy. I'll get to that in a bit. There is also a third kind of elf that I need to touch on too. So back to our question. What are the creatures we see in Santa Claus is Coming to Town? Well, we see that they are talented toy makers and craftsmen, which would match up with the Dark Elves, yes, but they are said to be dark-skinned. Well, actually, the Light Elves are also spoken about being craftsmen. Yet their arts are usually in magic, and particularly healing. So, it isn't a complete impossibility which group of elves they should belong to. But why do they have beards? Aren't elves usually shown to be clean-shaven, with minimal body hair? Okay, we need to go back to our good old friend J.R.R. Tolkien. It seems that he is the point where the elves lost their beards. Yet, isn't he also the one who gave dwarves beards? And I can see why he did this. If we go with the idea that dwarves are the Dark Elves, and the regular elves the Light Elves, he followed the idea that they look different. So one is tall, beautiful, and clean-shaven, that lives in forests, while the other is short and heavily bearded and is subterranean. But there is an issue with this idea in Tolkien's works. Orcs and goblins. Now I want to ask you about the brownie. It is a small breed of goblin which can be convinced to come and live in your house and will go around cleaning up for you. But if you give it clothes, it will leave. Now, this probably sounds similar to the house elf in Harry Potter, and yes, they are in fact the same. You see, the term fairy mostly ties back more to Celtic mythology, but ended up being similar to the use of elf. Do you remember the story about the elf, dwarf, and the silver pine cones? That is why a few accounts use the term fairy. It is the same as with the brownie. Often terms like elf, fairy, and goblin are used interchangeably. And in multiple languages, it becomes fairly easy to get multiple names for the same creature. Interestingly, there are even creatures similar to elves and fairies in Native American folklore, such as the Namirigar and the Nanupi. The idea that elves and fairies being short was inconsistent, but gained more traction around the 13th century with Oberon, the fictional fairy king. But this began to change with our friend Tolkien. He is where elves started getting tall again. Now, the point of all of this is that goblins and orcs are likely meant to be the real descriptions of the Dark Elves. Their behavior is a stark difference from the elves, and their aversion to sunlight, with subterranean nature, would potentially make them a better fit for the Dark Elves. Remember how I said that elves weren't considered completely humanoid earlier? This could help explain some of the looks we find in goblins and orcs, in addition to the distinction between dwarves, elves, and humans. Generally, they were placed in a similar category as the frost giants. Now, I did promise that there was a third group of elves in Norse mythology, and they are the Death Elves, also called the Ella Woman or Ella Folk. Be sure to use the word mythology when googling it, else you'll end up with nothing but women's magazines and whatnot. In Norse mythology, they're said to be human-like in appearance, but their back is missing and they are hollowed out, or it is said to look like the inside of a tree. A few tales even go so far as to say that they are soulless. Most accounts speak of them serving the sea giants and aided in the imprisonment of the goddess Iduna, until Loki helped her escape. Mind you, it was Loki's fault. In modern Danish mythology, the Ella women are known for their beauty, which makes them irresistible to mortals. Frequently, they are seen dancing in the moonlight and playing stringed instruments. Yet the male Ella folk have a breath of pestilence and disease. They are also known to have blue cattle. Yet we do see another creature in mythology which has a similar back, the Holdra, a sort of dryad troll hybrid. Though they are more beneficial and kind-hearted, only rarely do they get into issues with humans. This does bring up an interesting idea. Frequently, we see terms like elf, dwarf, fairy, goblin, ogre, troll, and so on used to describe a wide range of mythical creatures, even within a small area. Potentially, the idea of a goblin, orc, or ogre are the Dark Elves, while the things we think of as elves, fairies, and dwarves are all factions of the Light Elves. I don't have any hard evidence for this, but it's just speculation and a possible explanation, and could work. It is a general catch-all term like mammal, reptile, fish, and bird. If so, we could consider the term elf to be something like the class level of taxonomical system. Back to the Kringles. Well, Rankin Bass made Santa Claus is Coming to Town, but they also did the animated Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So you are probably thinking that Tolkien may have inspired them. But the Santa Claus is Coming to Town movie came out in 1970, and The Hobbit in 1977, with their Lord of the Rings in the following years. And Tolkien passed in 1973, before the films were made. Yet his books came out in 1937 and 1954, 1955. So definitely the possibility for influences. Yeah, Tolkien is responsible for much of how our modern fantasy is seen and our expectations. And there was an in-story reason behind the Kringle elves having beards. It ended up being part of Kris Kringle's disguise as he aged, and brought about the classic thick beard of Santa Claus. So seeing the elves with beards would have inspired him to grow one as well. And we partially see this in Rankin Bass's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which came out in 1965. In this version, the elves are more similar to what you expect. No beards, except for one with a goatee. So either influences from Tolkien, from Oberon being short, or a design choice. Without speaking to them directly, we can't find out. So there is a lot of mythology which ties back between dwarves and elves. And I am sure by now you can understand the frequent sources of conflicts with each other. Light versus dark, surface against underground. And you can see how it influenced Tolkien's writings. Well, minus the part about the orcs and goblins. But there could have been the Dark Elves versus the Black Elves issue I touched on earlier. Mind you, neither elf or dwarf are necessarily good things throughout history. A common term you'll find is elf-shot, a term which is meant as a kind of curse or pain, which could be inflicted on people, usually by elves. Overall, the term of elf and dwarf are tied with a great deal of history and mythology, and the line between them and other mythical creatures is hazy at best, and at worst, non-existent. So what do you think? What is up with Rankin Bass's elves and Santa Clauses coming to town? Thank you for watching, adventurers. Please return next time for An Underwater Civilization. Until then, I'll see you on the roads.